Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. And if you remember in my last video, I said something about labor unions. I didn't touch much on it at that point in time. I was just saying that it's probably because a lot of those robber barons that came out during this time, like John D. Rockefeller and Cornelius Vanderbilt, that probably lots of labor unions were formed. Because you remember how poor I said that laborers were getting treated. So the great success and wealth of the Gilded Age, remember, not felt by all Americans. This should have been made clear by what I've said in the past. There were many Americans who were suffering, or as some called themselves, victims of the rise of industrialization. So let's cover who was affected by the Gilded Age the most. The first group of people affected were the consumers, people who bought stuff, purchased goods from stores or everyday items like gasoline, clothes, groceries. People like us, we purchase things, and the rise of monopolies and trusts and the elimination of competition would allow these manufacturers to set prices without government regulations, leading to high-priced goods. The other group of Americans that were affected by industry was the laborer. And as factories grew and the application of interchangeable parts were incorporated into the manufacturing line, mass production grew quickly. And mass production produced goods more efficiently than the old ways of production, allowing more factories to spring up in cities across the United States. Factory work is unlike any other work that was being performed at the time, and there were several factors that led to the decline in the quality of working conditions in the late 1800s. The previous style of manufacturing used skilled craftspeople that would have made a product that would take more time and was usually a quality product. And the purpose of the Industrial Revolution was to manufacture goods more efficiently and cheaper, because the cheaper the product could be produced, the more profit that was made. And in order for that to happen, machines replaced the skilled workers. So the introduction of machines eliminated the need for the skilled labor. A person did not need any special skills or education in order to run a machine. Most often, the job only required pressing a button, pulling a lever, or moving a product, or attaching one piece to another. The duties of the laborer were now obsolete, which led to the mass hiring of unskilled factory workers. At this point, the factory owners stopped caring about the workforce, spurring the decline of work conditions. The only qualification was that the labor was cheap. If the worker endured the conditions, then according to social Darwinism, they would succeed. If not, they would be eliminated. When the factories hired the new unskilled and most times uneducated workers, they were able to pay them much less than the old skilled craftsmen. In 1909, Frederick Taylor was an efficiency expert who published a book named The Principles of Scientific Management, which encouraged factory managers to view workers as interchangeable parts. And that is what they did. The low-paid factory laborers would easily be replaced for any reason, and because of this, workers were overworked. But they brought costs of production down and production output and profits to rise. The worsening conditions, along with the long hours and overworking of laborers, led to an increase in workplace injuries and even deaths. A final way that factory owners would attempt to decrease the price of labor was that they employed many women and children, because women and children could be paid less than an adult male. To say that workers were being treated poorly was an understatement. Oftentimes, workers were subjected to small, overcrowded rooms where workers would become hot, bored, tired, and often more likely injured. These factory managers would not care much about their workers because they would just replace the broken ones, and working conditions became less and less a priority. Workers were often subjected to stuffy air, unsafe working conditions, long hours, low wages, no labor protection, and no job security, and women and children often had it worse than the men. Sweatshops were poorly lit and ventilated rooms where many men and women, or where many actual women, some men, would work producing textiles, Women would be forced to work all day and night, late into the night, most times without any breaks in the ability to talk to one another. They were threatened that if they would not get paid unless the work for the day was complete. And one historically famous sweatshop disaster was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory located in New York City. And in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on the top floors of a New York City high-rise building. Fabric was piled high in the sweatshop, and garment scraps were piled in trash cans. Some people believe that a lit cigarette was thrown into the scrap can, igniting the fabric. Now, the lone fire escape collapsed. Only one of the 4 elevators worked, and because management didn't trust the women, they locked them inside the factory. There was no way to escape. Over 140 women died in the fire for many different reasons, and it was the deadliest factory disaster in New York City until September 11th. After the fire, stricter building codes and fire regulations were passed. Children were unable to escape the dangers of work as well. Coal mining was a dangerous job to begin with. Shafts were small and could collapse and kill miners. In order for miners to reach the back of the mine, children were hired to fit into the small shafts. Mines were poorly lit and ventilated, and scraping the coal from the mine walls would often cause these cave-ins. Children worked 16 hours a day for roughly $1, and it was only a matter of time before things had to change. And the only way conditions were to change would be by the laborers leading the change. So these terrible working conditions faced by workers throughout cities in the United States brought out the fight in laborers and led to the creation of the first national labor unions. If you recall from past lessons, labor unions were formed when a group of workers had complaints about their working conditions. Remember, if one of the workers were to report to the factory manager and ask for a raise, the manager would terminate the employee because employees were a dime a dozen. They were interchangeable parts. So one worker was easily fired and replaced. However, if a group of workers reported to the manager asking for a raise, the manager would have second thoughts about firing all of the workers because no one would be there left to manufacture their goods, and another group of workers would need to be hired. So during industrialization, more labor unions were formed and workers demanded better conditions. So factory workers organized and began to form labor unions. The first union we'll discuss today is the Knights of Labor, and the Knights of Labor was formed as a secret society of workers in 1869 and became one of the very first organizations of united workers. The Knights of Labor consisted of skilled and unskilled workers. To many people, it is considered to be the first true labor union. It continued to be a secret organization until 1879, when Terence Powderly became the Grand Master Workman, which was the leader of the organization, and Powderly ended the secrecy of the organization and began to fight publicly for workers. He believed in using boycotts rather than the typical weapon of the union, the strike, or the refusal to work until demands are met. The Knights of Labor fought for important issues like 8-hour workday, equal pay for equal work, and the abolition or the end to child labor. By 1866, the members of the union rose to about 700,000 members until strikes and violence struck the nation's union's protests. In 1866, violence erupted at a labor protest at Haymarket Square, Chicago, known today as the Haymarket Riots, the Haymarket Square Riot. Protesters became agitated when police arrived at the square and ordered this crowd to disperse. Now, violence erupted between the police and the labor protesters, and a bomb was thrown into the crowd by an unknown person, and police responded with gunfire. At the end of all this violence, 7 police officers were killed and 60 others were wounded, and 8 civilians were killed and nearly 40 civilians were wounded. And Powderly knew protests were not the answer, and as a result of the Haymarket Square riot, the power of the Knights of Labor declined, as well did the membership. And by 1890, the union numbered only about 100,000 members, down from that 700,000 number. So after the Knights of Labor, there were more unions and more strikes that followed. Another union that was formed was called the American Federation of Labor. And in 1866, after the fall of the Knights of Labor, Samuel Gompers created the AFL. Taking a different approach to the Knights of Labor, the AFL limited its membership to only skilled workers and formed one large union from numerous smaller unions like the Mine Workers Union and the Steel Workers Union. Gompers chose to use collective bargaining to get results, and collective bargaining is when all the workers acted together to negotiate with management about their demands. No matter the union, protests, or strikes, they were imminent. They were going to happen, and when they did, they often turned violent and failed to accomplish their goals. So there were labor strikes that went on here too. And two labor strikes that will be covered in the chapter, the Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. In 1892, at the Carnegie Steel Company in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the nation's strongest labor union of iron and steel workers was successful at contract negotiations for themselves. Carnegie did not like that the union controlled so much power at his plant, and he wanted to break it up. The plant manager wound up speeding up production and required extra hours, and when the union workers refused, they were all fired. Since the union workers were skilled workers only, they were not the majority of the workforce. However, upon hearing of the mass terminations, the rest of the plant went on strike. An armed battle commenced between the union workers and a collection of 300 Pinkerton guards, and the conflict left both union workers and guards injured and killed. After a militia was called in to quell the conflict, someone tried to kill the plant manager, and as a result, the community lost faith in the union lost, and workers suffered. Which leads us to the Pullman Strike. In 1894, George Pullman, the owner of the Pullman Sleeping Car Company, which was a company that manufactured train cars where people slept on long trips, fired many of his workers and cut many of the salaries of his laborers. There was an issue with that. The other issue was that in the town where most of the workers lived, which is called Pullman, Illinois, the workers lived in the town where the business owner, George Pullman, controlled the stores and the rent on all the homes. So Pullman cut their pay but did not reduce rents or prices on products in the stores. So the Pullman workers across the nation went on strike and the railroad suffered as a result. So protests in the streets led to the state militia being called again and the federal troops sent out to dismiss the protests. Rioting broke out here again. Train cars were destroyed, and federal officers fired into this crowd of rioters, killing 7 and wounding 30 more. Federal troops ended the Pullman Strike and gave the unions another loss, and workers suffered again.